A man walks into a steel mill, he punches in, he talks to a coworker, then he vanishes. No body, no blood, just a hard hat in the wrong part of the plant and a set of keys sitting at the bottom of an acid vat. This is the disappearance of Jim Donnelly, and 20 years later, nobody can explain how a 43-year-old family man simply ceased to exist inside one of the most dangerous workplaces in New Zealand. Jim Donnelly was 43-year-old when he disappeared, and by every account, he was exactly the kind of person you'd expect to see punching in every single morning without fail. He worked as a process engineer at Glenbrook Steel Mill, not a minor role, not something sitting at a desk far from the real action. He was right in the middle of it, overseeing the industrial processes that kept the mill running. The work where attention to detail isn't optional, because if something slips, the consequences are severe. Outside the mill, he had a full life. He was married to Tracy Donnelly, and the two of them were raising young children together. Nothing in the picture of his home life suggested instability. No obvious fractures, no warning signs that something was quietly falling apart. The portrait that family, friends, and colleagues all painted of Jim was strikingly consistent. He was reliable. He showed up when he said he would. He was punctual to a degree that the people around him apparently noticed that he was remarkably punctual. And above all, he was methodical. The kind of person who works through problems carefully, doesn't cut corners, and doesn't leave things unresolved. That reputation isn't just background detail. It's one of the most important things to hold on to when you are trying to make sense of what happened. Because when someone like Jim vanishes without a trace, the easy explanations, a spontaneous decision, an impulsive act, a moment of carelessness don't really hold up. His entire professional and personal history argued against that kind of behavior. Whatever happened on June 21st is almost certainly wasn't accidental in the conventional sense, and it almost certainly was out of the character for no reason at all. Let's talk about Glenbrook Steel Mill a little bit. Glenbrook Steel Mill sits in South Auckland, New Zealand, and its sheer scale is something you need to understand before any of the rest of this makes sense to you. The site covers roughly 4.5 square kilometers, a sprawling complex of industrial infrastructure that includes furnaces, chemical processing units, conveyor systems, pipelines, vats, all operating as part of an interconnected system that requires skilled engineers just to keep running day to day. This is not a workplace where you wander off and someone immediately notices. Sections of the mill at noise levels that make shouting to someone a few meters away pointless. The heat near the furnaces is extreme. Tanks holding industrial-grade acids capable of breaking down organic material, including, and this becomes relevant later, human remains. Access across the site wasn't casual. Restricted zones existed throughout the mill, with protocols in place to manage who went where and when. This was selected high-hazard industrial environment, and it was treated accordingly. But here's what makes the detail cut both ways. The same restricted access that was supposed to keep people safe also created pockets of the mill that were rarely checked, rarely monitored, and not fully covered by the CCTV infrastructure available in 2004. The cameras were there, but they didn't cover everything. In the areas they didn't reach, the visibility of investigators, for colleagues, for anyone, was essentially zero. Here's what makes Jim's disappearance harder to dismiss as a random industrial accident. The days leading up to June 21st weren't normal, not by the standards of someone who'd built his entire reputation on being steady and punctual. Someone had shifted in him, quietly, in the 72 hours before he walked into the mill, and he never came back out. The people closest to Jim were the first to pick up on it. Tracy noticed it at home. The man she knew, composed, consistent, and agitated in a way she couldn't place. He wasn't exploding or breaking down. It was more contained than that, like someone carrying something they hadn't decided to share yet. He was being secretive, not in obvious dramatic way, but in a small behavioral shifts that are actually harder to explain away. Conversations that went shorter than usual, questions that were vague, and answers that are incomplete. A general sense that he was somewhere else mentally, even when he was physically present. For a man whose reliability and openness were two of his defining traits, the kind of withdrawal that the family is noticing was enough that stuck with Tracy and his kids. And it's the kind of thing that only gets examined more closely in hindsight once you know what comes next. Then there was the meeting. At some point during those final days, Jim mentioned to Tracy that he had a meeting scheduled on June 21st. He didn't explain what it was about, didn't say who it was with, and critically, when investigators later went through the mill's internal record looking for any trace of it. There was nothing. No scheduled meeting in the logs. No record of an appointment. No paper trail connecting to Jim to anyone on that specific date for that specific purpose. And then there was the bookstore. In those days before June 21st, Jim stopped at a bookstore, apparently looking for a specific title. He didn't find it, or at least didn't purchase it, and no one who knew him could identify what the book was. The title was never confirmed. What makes it worth noting isn't the act itself. People browse bookstores, that's not remarkable. It's the specificity of it. He wasn't browsing, he was looking for something in particular. And whatever that something was, it mattered enough to him in those final days that he went looking for it. The morning of June 21st on the surface looked like every other morning. Jim left the house at 6:30 a.m. on time, and you'd expect from him. Nothing about his departure suggested to Tracy that this was anything other than a regular workday. He wasn't rushed, wasn't visibly upset, didn't say anything that would later stand out as a farewell or a signal. Before he got into his car, he had a brief interaction with a neighbor. Again, nothing alarming. A passing exchange, a few words out of ordinary formality. The neighbor would later recall it as entirely unremarkable. Jim seemed fine, normal, and present. And then he got in the car, he drove to Glenbrook Mill, and that was that. But the 3 days before told a different story. Whatever Jim was preparing for, or worried about, or trying to resolve, he kept it close. He didn't explain it to Tracy, didn't document it anywhere investigators could find later, and didn't give anyone around enough information to act on. Whether that was deliberate or not, the result was the same. When he disappeared, the people trying to understand why he had almost nothing from the days preceding to it work with, just fragments. Everything that can be confirmed about Jim's last known movements fits inside a window of roughly 2 hours. He arrived at mill at normal time, went through the motions of starting his workday, and then somewhere between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. he stopped appearing. He was simply there, and then he wasn't. Jim pulled into the employee parking lot at the mill at approximately 7 a.m. He parked his car, the same car that would still be sitting there, locked and untouched, well into the evening, and punched in for his shift. That part is documented. The punch-in record places him at the mill on time. After that, he made it to his office. Colleagues saw him there during that early morning stretch, and nothing about his manner apparently sets off any alarms. Whether anyone spoke to him at length during that window isn't entirely clear, but the general impression from those who saw him was that he was in his usual mode. What was happening inside his head during those 2 hours, whether the weight of whatever had been troubling him through the previous 3 days was still sitting on him, no one can say. This is where the trail goes cold, and it goes cold fast. Jim was scheduled for an internal meeting that morning. He didn't show up for it. For a man whose punctuality was practically a defining characteristic, not appearing for a scheduled meeting was the kind of absence that stood out. His colleagues noticed that immediately. The last confirmed sighting of Jim places him near the oxygen plant, a section of the mill that sits well away from the general traffic of the site. A co-worker saw him there, which was the last time anyone could say with certainty that they had eyes on him. After that, nothing. No further sightings, no indication from anyone working that day that they had seen where he went or what he was doing. The oxygen plant wasn't a casual area, not the kind of place you pass through on the way to somewhere else. If Jim was there, he was there for a reason. Whether that reason was work-related, connected to the unverifiable meeting he'd mentioned to Tracy, or something else entirely, nobody has been able to establish with any confidence. What was established is that after that sighting, Jim effectively ceased to exist within any verifiable record that day at the mill. The working day wounds down, shifts ended, employees left, and Jim's car didn't move. It was still sitting in the employee parking lot when Tracy raised the alarm that evening after Jim failed to come home. That in itself was enough. Tracy knew something was wrong before anyone at the mill had formally registered his absence as a problem. His car was just sitting there, quietly confirming that wherever Jim had gone, he hadn't driven himself out. That detail effectively closed off one of the more straightforward explanations, that he'd simply left. You don't leave voluntarily and leave your car behind in a locked employee lot without making some kind of arrangement. And if he'd arranged something, no one at the mill or in his life had any knowledge of it. The car became one of the earliest fixed points in the investigation that would struggle repeatedly to find fixed point at all. By the time that evening ended, the search for Jim had begun. What investigators were walking into, the scale of the site, the nature of its hazards, and the near total absence of witnesses to whatever happened in that 1 hour window meant that they were already working against the clock and against the environment itself. When a person disappears inside a huge industrial complex, the search for physical evidence is already working at a disadvantage. The site is too large, too hazardous to sweep quickly or cleanly, but investigators and searchers at the mill did eventually find things. Not a body, they never found that, but objects that belonged to Jim. And the way those objects were found, where they were found, and the condition they were in when they turned up raised more questions than they were resolved. The first thing recovered was Jim's hard hat. It turned up days after his disappearance, in a part of the mill that had no obvious connection to his regular work. Not near his office, not near the oxygen plant where he was last seen, somewhere remote, somewhere that required a deliberate route to reach. For a piece of mandatory safety equipment that an engineer at a site like Glenbrook would wear throughout his shift, finding it sitting in an unrelated corner of the complex was immediately strange and a red flag. These kind of hats don't migrate on their own. They end up where someone puts them or where someone drops them in a hurry, and the location here fit neither of those explanations comfortably. Then during a later and more targeted research of the site, investigators turned their attention to the chemical vats. These are the industrial tanks holding the kinds of acids used in large-scale steel processing. One of those tanks, designated the K6 tank, became the focus of a discovery that effectively changed the entire character of the investigation. Inside that acid vat, searchers found Jim keyring, and alongside the keys in the same tank, his wallet and his phone. All of it together in one place, submerged in acid. The wallet is worth standing with because it immediately eliminated one of the most common explanations of a person vanishing. It still contained cash, not emptied out, not stripped of anything valuable. The money was still there. Whatever happened to Jim, it wasn't robbery. That particular angle closed quickly. But the most significant detail, the one that investigators couldn't look past, was the condition and positioning of the items inside the K6 tank. The assessment that came out of the search was that the items had been placed into the vat, not dropped. That's not a subtle distinction. There is a meaningful physical difference between objects that fall into a tank. They should be scattered, distributed by momentum, and objects that are deliberately put into these kind of information should look like something like that. Whether that someone was Jim himself or another person entirely is a question that was never been answered with any certainty. But the act, if it was an act, had a quality of intent to it that a simple accident doesn't produce. The acid environment created its own problems for the investigation. Acid at industrial concentration levels breaks down organic material over time, completely and without remind under the right conditions. If Jim had gone into the vat or any other vat on the site, the absence of biological evidence wasn't just possible, it was chemically predictable. Investigators found no blood, no DNA, no biological trace anywhere on the site that could possibly link to Jim. That absence doesn't prove he ended up in the acid, but it also doesn't rule it out. And in forensic investigation, an environment that can erase evidence this completely is an investigation's worst case scenario. Finding out what happened to Jim was never going to be straightforward. What it ultimately ran into wasn't a lack of effort. It was a case that kept refusing to give investigators anything concrete enough to build on. The immediate priority after Jim's disappearance was registered, and that was getting eyes on every part of the mill that could plausibly tell investigators something. That meant an extensive sweep of the entire site, a systematic effort to cover a complex that includes furnaces, chemical tanks, and large stretches of industrial infrastructure that doesn't lend themselves to quick inspection. Parallel to the physical search, police were working through the human side of the investigation. Everyone who worked at the mill and could potentially have seen or interacted with Jim on June 21st was interviewed. That significant number of people across a large site, and the process of working through those interviews, cross-checking accounts, looking for inconsistencies, identifying anyone who might have information they hadn't volunteered, took time and coordination. The interviews didn't produce a witness who could place Jim somewhere. After his last confirmed sighting near the oxygen plant, nobody came forward with an account of seeing him in the later part of that critical morning window. Nobody reported an argument, a confrontation, or any interaction that seems unusual. The co-worker who spotted him near the oxygen plant remained the last confirmed witness. After that, the human record of June 21st was simply blank where Jim was concerned. Background checks were run. Jim's financial records were pulled and examined in detail, looking for the kind of activity that might suggest he was planning to disappear. Large cash withdrawals, unusual transfers, anything that pointed to preparation for a staged exit. There was nothing. His finances showed no usual movement in the period leading up to his disappearances. No accounts quietly being drawn down, no signs that he'd been setting up something up. Whatever happened, it either wasn't financially motivated or it was arranged entirely outside of the banking system in a way that left no trace, which for a process engineer managing a family household would have been an unusual capability. The mysterious meeting that Jim had mentioned to Tracy in the days before also went nowhere during the inquiry. Investigators checked the mill's internal scheduling and logs and found nothing corresponding to what he described. The investigation didn't fail because of poor police work. It failed, or more precisely, stalled because of what the environment had already done to the evidence before investigators even arrived. The complete absence of biological evidence at the site was central forensic problem. Nothing that placed Jim at any specific location within the mill in a way that could be scientifically confirmed. Without it, investigators were working almost entirely from object placement and witness accounts, both of which were limited and neither of which could answer the core question of cause. The CCTV situation compounded everything. 2004 was not an era of comprehensive industrial surveillance. The cameras that existed at the mill covered certain areas, but the internal zones of the mill weren't fully monitored. The oxygen plant area where Jim was last seen and the area around the K6 tank fell into parts of the site where camera coverage was either minimal or non-existent. In locations that matter most of understanding what happened between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m., there was simply no footage to analyze. There are few theories and few angles here about Jim's disappearance. Let's talk about them for a bit. The first theory is that could this disappearance be staged? Was it done on purpose? Is the whole thing planted? This theory starts with a simple idea. Jim walked away from his life on purpose, not because he was crazy, not because he hated his family, but because something, stress, debt, an affair, a secret he couldn't face, pushed him to an edge. And instead of breaking, he planned and left. Jim purposely left his life due to unknown stressors. Supporters of this theory point to the days leading up to June 21st. The agitation, the secrecy, the mysterious meeting that left no trace. That is not the behavior of a man going to work like any other day. That's the behavior of a man trying up loose ends. But where's the proof? No money was drawn from joint accounts. No passport went missing. No suitcase. No goodbye letter. Tracy says Jim had no mistress, no secret gambling habit, and no hidden debt. The police checked his financial records. Nothing was unusual. So if he staged his own disappearance, he did it without any of the usual tools. That's hard to pull off in 2004 before the internet made fake IDs easy. But there's the problem. If Jim wanted to fake his death, why leave his car in parking lot? Why punch in for work? The second theory suggests that maybe an accidental death occurred somewhere on the site, or did he possibly commit suicide? This is the simplest explanation. Jim died at the mill. Either he fell into something or he jumped. Jim fell into a vat or furnace, leaving no remains. Glenbrook is full of ways to die. Molten metal, acid baths, moving machinery. If a body falls into a furnace running at 1500 degrees Celsius, there is nothing left to find. No bones, no DNA. Just ash that gets mixed in with the slag. Same goes to the acid vats, especially the K6 tank where his keys and wallet were found. Industrial acids don't just dissolve tissue, they break down bone, even teeth over time. If Jim fell into that vat headfirst, his body could have been completely destroyed within hours. That would explain why no remains were ever recovered. But here's what doesn't fit. The hard hat. Why was it found in a remote part of the mill? A place Jim had no reason to visit. If he fell into the K6 fixed vat, the vat and the hard hat location weren't the same place. So if he fell into an acid, how did his hat end up somewhere else? Did he take it off, walk to a different area, and then come back to the vat? That doesn't make sense for an accident. Suicide is harder to rule out. Jim was disturbed, secretive, under some kind of stress he wouldn't talk about. A man in that state could decide to end things, and a steel mill offers a kind of finality you can't get from a bridge or a rope. No body, no funeral, just gone. But the problem with suicide is that there was no witnesses, no note, and no clear reason why Jim would choose a method that left no trace, unless leaving no trace was the point. The third theory suggests that someone murdered him, or that there is some kind of foul play involved. Was someone stalking him, or was there an enemy out there to get him? Something along those lines. Someone killed Jim and someone inside the mill knows about it. This theory starts with the last confirmed sighting. A co-worker saw Jim near the oxygen plant around 9 to 9:30 a.m. If foul play happened, the oxygen plant area matters. It is remote, less foot traffic than the main production floors. Good place for a private conversation or an ambush. Who would want Jim dead? Another worker, a supervisor, someone he was about to report for a safety violation or a cost of overrun? Jim was a process engineer. His job was to find inefficiencies. Sometimes that meant telling people they were doing things wrong. In a tight-knit mill culture, that can make enemies. Theories that he stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see is that this is the darker version of foul play. Jim didn't have enemies. He just walked into the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe he saw something illegal, theft of materials, drug use, an unsafe shortcut that could get people killed. Maybe he saw something he wasn't supposed to see, and the person who saw him see it decided to silence him. But the problem with this theory is evidence. No blood, no weapon, no witness who came forward. If Jim was killed, the killer had to dispose of the body inside a working steel mill during a normal shift. That's possible. Furnaces and acid vats are great to get rid of evidence, but it's risky. Mill workers have a code. They don't talk to outsiders, but would they protect a murderer? That's a heavy accusation, and so far nobody's broken. Losing someone is one thing. Losing someone without a body, without a confession, that's a different kind of hell, and that's exactly where Tracy has lived since June 21st, 2004. Most families get closure, a funeral, a death certificate that says something. Cancer, car accident, heart attack. Even murder gives you direction to point your anger. But when a person vanishes and official ruling is undetermined, you don't get any of that. You just get questions. From day one, Tracy did what you're supposed to do. She called the police, she talked to the mill, she sat through interviews, she answered the same questions from the same detectives until she wanted to scream. But what she learned was when a workplace like Glenbrook is involved, you are not the priority. The mill has lawyers. The mill has a reputation to protect. The mill has insurance policies and risk assessments and a bottom line. Tracy just had a missing husband and two young kids who kept asking when daddy was coming home. She didn't stop. Over the years, she pushed for new searches. She begged for access to areas of the plant that had been cleared. Week after the disappearance, she hired her own investigators when she could afford it. She kept doing searching for answers because the alternative, sitting quietly and accepting that Jim was gone, felt like giving up. In New Zealand, you can't get a death certificate for a missing person until 7 years have passed, unless there is a compelling evidence of death. The coroner's 2007 ruling helped. It officially stated that Jim died at the mill on June 21st, 2004. That let Tracy skip the 7-year wait. But even with that ruling, getting the certificate wasn't automatic. More paperwork, more hearing, more reliving the worst days of her life. But you can ask, why does a death certificate matter? Money. Because of money and life insurance policies. And if you are a stay-home mom with 2 kids and your spouse's income just vanished, you are in trouble fast. Tracy had to fight for survival benefits. She had to prove to banks that Jim wasn't coming back. She had to explain to her children over and over again why there was no funeral. Try telling a 6-year-old that daddy's body dissolved in an acid. Then try telling them you don't actually know if that's what happened. The financial strain nearly broke her. Friends helped, family pitched in, but there's a reason most missing person cases end up in divorce and bankruptcy before they end up in answers. 3 years after Jim's disappearance, New Zealand coroner's office finally held an inquest. This was closure closest thing to a trial the case would ever get. No defendant, no jury, just a coroner, a pile of evidence, and a room full of people who needed to hear something official. Coroner ruled Jim died at the mill on June 21st, but the cause was undetermined. Let's be clear what that means. The coroner accepted that Jim was dead, and the place of death was Glenbrook Steel Mill on the day he disappeared. The coroner looked at all theories, so they landed on undetermined. For Tracy, that ruling was a gut punch. She'd spent 3 years hoping for something definitive, a name, a cause, a reason. Instead, she got a legal opinion that raised as many questions as it answered. No evidence was found to support one specific theory over another. That's the real takeaway from the inquest. The investigation closed in 2007, the case went cold, and Tracy went home to raise her 2 children without their father, armed with a piece of paper that said her husband was dead but offered no explanation for how or why. Some families find peace in finality. Tracy never got that. What she got was a legal ruling and a lifetime of wondering. That's not a closure. That's all for today's video. I will see you in next case, in next video. Until then, subscribe to the channel. Goodbye and good night.